Okay, class, today's lesson is on Chapter 10, Lesson 3. We'll continue with our discussion on the nicotine addiction and the craving cycle that happens in nicotine addicts. We'll touch on briefly how nicotine changes the chemistry of the brain, and we'll finish up the lesson talking about some of the reasons why teens begin the tobacco habit. Okay, let's start off by answering the question in the top right-hand corner up here. Okay, we've answered this before. Why do people get hooked on tobacco? We know that the answer is nicotine. Nicotine is what hooks the user. It's what makes the user crave the product. And because of this nicotine, we know that the user forms an addiction. Now there's two types of addiction or dependence that we're going to talk about associated with tobacco use. We're going to talk about a physical dependence. We're going to talk about a psychological dependence. Now, if you reduce, cut off, or take away the supply of nicotine from somebody who is addicted, the result is withdrawal. Now, withdrawal are the unpleasant symptoms that somebody experiences when you take away something to which they're addicted. In this case, we're talking about nicotine. Those unpleasant symptoms that a person would experience through nicotine withdrawal include things such as anxiousness, irritability. They become a little bit more cranky, a little bit more irritable, nervousness, edginess. There might be even a slight depression, moodiness associated with it. And then we have a little bit of an increased appetite, hungry more often. And this is one of the reasons why individuals who are addicted to nicotine are reluctant to try to quit the habit, because they're afraid of that weight gain that's associated with quitting the tobacco habit. Now, there are two types of dependence when we talk about nicotine addiction. The first one over here on the left, we have psychological dependence. What this is the person believes in his or her mind that they must have this drug, this chemical, this substance in order to function, to feel good, or to feel normal. What happens is the user, nicotine user, will often incorporate and associate their tobacco use or their nicotine habit with enjoyable activities in a daily routine. For example, talking on the phone and having a cigarette, or waking up first thing in the morning and having a cup of coffee and a cigarette, or taking a break from work and having a cigarette. They'll associate that nicotine habit and incorporate it into a daily routine, things that they do on a daily basis at the same time. So what they wind up having to do, all right, if they're going to break this habit, they're going to break this psychological dependence, they need to change their habits that are associated with that tobacco use. Okay, so instead of sitting down after dinner and having that cup of coffee and that cigarette, going for a walk or going for a run or doing something different. Same thing when they wake up in the morning. Instead of having that cup of coffee and that cigarette, try to change your habits in some way so that they're breaking that routine. On the right-hand side, we have a physical dependence. In this case, what happens is the body develops a chemical need for the drug, the chemical, the substance, in this case nicotine. All right, with physical dependence, this addiction is directly related to the nicotine itself. Okay, and what happens is when blood nicotine levels get low, that will then trigger cravings in the user. Okay, and you can see I have a little diagram here that'll explain kind of a little bit about the craving cycle, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes as well. So what happens is the person will have a craving or withdrawal symptoms, which will then cause them to smoke a cigarette. That will release chemicals in the brain, including dopamine, which is responsible for the pleasurable feeling in the brain. As the nicotine levels fall, all right, there's an imbalance in the chemical activity, which will then cause the cravings again, and this is a cycle that continues. Now, as a person continues to use tobacco, the body's tolerance for nicotine actually increases. Okay, and I have a question for you at the bottom. Now, because of this, all right, what happens to the amount of time between the user's cravings? So because of this tolerance that develops, what happens to the amount of time between cravings for a nicotine user and a nicotine addict? Okay, so be sure to research that question on the tolerance and what happens between the amount of time between the nicotine cravings, and bring that answer to class. Now here you'll see we have a nicotine level and a craving cycle. Okay, and I tried to do a color code so it's easier for you to see. You'll see that all the blue is when nicotine levels are low, which triggers cravings. All the greens is when the individual gets their nicotine fix, which causes blood nicotine levels to rise. And all the pink is when those nicotine levels begin to drop again. Okay, so for visual effect, to kind of help you see it's color-coded, you'll see here we start off with the nicotine levels in the user are low, which triggers the craving. So the person has that craving for nicotine. Their blood levels in nicotine are low, triggers the cravings. So the user will then get their nicotine fix, either through cigarette, cigar, or smokeless tobacco. Blood nicotine levels rise, they feel normal, okay, they feel good. After a while, what happens is those nicotine levels begin to drop again. They don't stay up for forever. They begin to drop. And as they begin to drop, blood levels, nicotine levels get low again, triggers the cravings. The user has to have their nicotine fix. Blood nicotine levels rise. Eventually those blood nicotine levels drop again, triggers our cravings again, and this is a cycle that just continues and continues and continues in the user. Okay, now let's take a couple of minutes and talk specifically about the effects of the nicotine addiction on the brain and brain chemistry. Now, if you remember, we talked about nicotine and the effects of nicotine on the brain. And we talked about one of those effects that nicotine has on the brain is the release of dopamine, which is the brain chemical that's responsible for sensations of pleasure, feelings of pleasure. Now, this prolonged feelings of high and euphoria and pleasure enhances the addictive effects of the nicotine itself. What you also need to understand is that the nicotine actually changes the chemistry of our brain. Okay. I have 4 little stages here, little steps down at the bottom. Now, we have talked about when we take in nicotine into our system, we have these receptors in our brain. All right, we'll call them nicotine receptors. When nicotine gets into the bloodstream, these nicotine receptors absorb that nicotine. Okay, as you can see here. Okay. So previously we talked about the craving cycle. When blood nicotine levels get low, it triggers the cravings in tobacco users. So in order to satisfy the cravings, the user has to get their nicotine fix, whether through cigarettes or pipes or cigars or smokeless tobacco. And when they do that, they satisfy those cravings. Okay. As we said, that satisfaction doesn't last forever. Soon what's going to happen is those blood nicotine levels are going to drop again. It's going to trigger the cravings in the tobacco user. They're going to have to satisfy those cravings by getting their nicotine fix, and that cycle continues. What people don't realize is that this continued exposure to nicotine actually changes the chemistry of the brain. So as a person continues to use tobacco for a period of time, they actually start to develop more of these nicotine receptors in the brain. Now, as a result of having more receptors in the brain, the person needs more nicotine to fill all those receptors. And this is how they develop this tolerance. Because of the added receptors, the nicotine user has to have larger doses, or more frequent doses, to continue to produce the same effect, to produce the same feeling of pleasure or high or euphoria. And that's how the person starts to develop a tolerance for that nicotine. And that actually affects the amount of time between their cravings. Okay, I asked you a question earlier. What happens to the amount of time between the cravings of a tobacco user as they continue to use tobacco? Okay, and this can kind of explain that. And we'll talk about this when you come to class. Okay, let's finish off today's lesson talking about some reasons why teens might begin to use tobacco. There's a lot of money spent every year in an attempt to educate teens and youth and our public in general on the negative effects of tobacco use. And it's working. Right now we're seeing an all-time low of teenagers using tobacco products. It's roughly at about 16%, which is pretty amazing when you think that as early as 2000, that number was 34% of teenagers who have used or tried tobacco products. And despite that, there are still teenagers who use tobacco. So what are some reasons why they might begin? Well, the first reason I have here is peer pressure. We talked about one of our emotional needs as human beings is the need to belong or to be accepted, to be part of a crowd. Okay, so peer pressure sometimes is very difficult for us to say no to or to walk away with because we do have that inner desire to be accepted. Okay, as you see here when I talk about peer pressure, those are some of the things when I talk about. When you have friends or a group of friends that might use tobacco, sometimes it's hard to say no and to exclude yourself from that group. You don't want to be left out. Another reason why teens might begin to use tobacco is the element or the thought that it's something cool to do. They may believe it's the cool thing to do or it makes them look cool. Now you'll notice here that I spelled the word cool with a K. There's a reason why I did that. There's a brand of cigarettes called Kools, K-O-O-L-S. Now I don't think that's any coincidence that this company branded the name of their cigarettes Kools. Okay, I think there's a reason why they did that little advertisement ploy. Another reason is they may feel that it makes them look older, more adult, more mature, more sophisticated. Okay? There's the curiosity and experimentation aspect of it. All right, some teens might be curious as to what it's like. What are the effects? What are the feelings that tobacco produces? So they might have that experimentation factor to see what it's like. Problem with that is it might start out as a curiosity or an experimentation type thing. But we know that nicotine is extremely addictive. And it might only take one use for the person to become addicted. There's a danger there. Okay? Okay, I have a few more reasons why teens might begin to use tobacco. You'll see up here I have parents use tobacco. Children of parents who use tobacco products are more likely themselves, or possibly more likely themselves, to use tobacco. They tend to model the behavior of their parents or their older siblings that they see using the tobacco. And studies actually show that children of tobacco users are more likely to try it out, to experiment, and to seek it out than children of parents who do not use tobacco. Next one I have here is famous people. Okay, sometimes we see celebrities or famous role models who we admire or aspire to be like using tobacco. And whether it's people with a lot of fame and fortune, actors, actresses on TV, whether they're using it in real life or in TV shows or in movies. And then also I have professional athletes sometimes that we see using tobacco products. For example, when I was a young boy, I looked up to professional baseball players, and I wanted to be a professional baseball player. And sometimes when I watched them on television, I saw them using smokeless tobacco. Now, luckily, I never fell into that trap. And looking back on it now, I'm able to see that that's not a positive image, all right, for youngsters and for youth. Okay, but we do see that. These are people that we look up to, people that we want to be like. Now, you'll notice on your homework worksheet, I have a question for you, where I want you to kind of explain the influence that parents, role models, celebrities who use tobacco, people that we look up to that use tobacco, how do they have influence or potential influence on teens beginning the habit? Okay, and these are the things when I talked about. That's what I want you to answer in there. Okay, so we'll answer those and we'll talk a little bit more about those in class. The last one I have here is rebelling. Now, sometimes we do things simply because we're told not to. Now, in this case, when I talk about rebelling, sometimes children or teenagers have their parents telling them not to use tobacco. Yet the parents themselves are using the tobacco products. So they might look at the parents and be like, you're telling me that I can't use tobacco or don't use tobacco, yet you're sitting right here in the house smoking a cigarette or the pipe or the cigar. If it's okay for you, why isn't it okay for me? What's the difference? There's a double standard here. So that might motivate or push the youngster, the teenager, to try to seek it out and try and experiment themselves. Now, there's more reasons why teens begin to use tobacco. These are just some of the major ones that I picked out and wanted to discuss. Okay? So we'll discuss these more in class. And if you have any questions, all right, bring them to class with you.